Hello.
Okay, so I want you to appreciate the fact that an ecosystem is not just the living organisms, not just the plants and the critters that exist in a particular area, but it is them as well as the non-living parts, or what we call the abiotic parts of that area and ecosystem that they interact with as well. As a matter of fact, an ecosystem is built around the physical factors that exist there in the first place. Primarily water, temperature, sunlight, etc. There's a whole lot of them, as we'll go into right here. From there, you typically have the basis of the food chain, your producers, that are adapted to a particular set of physical conditions. And then from there, you have the food chain going on up with your consumers and eventually your decomposers. And those organisms are adapted both to the physical conditions that are there, as well as the other organisms that are in the environment. So everybody should be off your phones, paying attention, please. And so what we see is a hierarchy. In other words, from larger collection to smaller. The biosphere, this is our fourth sphere, as I mentioned. This is basically all of the ecosystems of the Earth connected together, and they are. No ecosystem exists on its own. As a matter of fact, defining what is an ecosystem can sometimes, be just basically up to the observer to say, this is a particular, what we want to define as an ecosystem. But you always have movement into and out of those ecosystems by organisms, or maybe they're products of those ecosystems and things, the way they change the water chemistry and stuff, that's going to affect other ecosystems as well. So none of them are isolated, and they're all affected by each other. So consequently, all those ecosystems together of the Earth come together to form what we call the biosphere, the living part of the Earth. But the biosphere does include the physical parts of the Earth, the other three spheres, specifically where they're being acted upon or by the organisms. So that's what your biosphere is. It's broken into ecosystems. Once again, ecosystems living in non-living parts, abiotic and biotic and abiotic parts. If you take out all of the abiotic, the physical parts, oops. That's on tape. I'll have to edit that. I didn't say that on purpose, by the way. You have what's known as the community. Community.
How are you going to edit that out?
Okay, so you can think of this as, within a city, you have this physical structures of the city and everything itself, but the people of that city make up that community. Okay, and we assume with the community that all the parts of the community, and this is what we call the populations, that they interact with each other. Okay, and so the next step down is that community is made up of different populations of different organisms. Each population is of a single species. It's something we call a breeding unit.
Breeding.
Yes, breeding. Yeah, we'll get to sex later, but so that is what defines a species in particular, is the fact that it can reproduce. A population, that designation is important, of course, because the way that that's how a population continues itself on is through reproduction, and the effects of the environment. A large part of that has a lot of influence on what happens with reproduction and this also shows us where another thing that we tend to associate with population. What do we oftentimes associate with population, just besides it, rather than it being just a group? We also oftentimes use it as instead of a name of something, but so when we say the U.S. population is, what would you think? A lot, which means it's a number, right?
Oh, never mind.
So we oftentimes associate with population, we associate a number, which is typically of a particular population, the number of those organisms. So that's, of course, an important characteristic of that group. But they're all the same species, so they can interbreed and everything, and therefore those population numbers are going to be affected by that. And then, of course, you have the individual organisms that make up that environment lastly. And you could continue to go on. You'll see in some illustrations where it shows you the hierarchy where it goes all the way down to atom. It's kind of obvious, but you know that's there as well. But we'll stick to these 5 different levels in the hierarchy. Okay. Now, the abiotic factors. This is not all-inclusive. There's a number of different things. pH is good. That's actually not one of the ones I chose to list, so that's okay. But group 4, you definitely get the point for it. Probably the most important one, as you might be well aware, is water. The amount of water available. Okay. In a terrestrial ecosystem, of course. Of course, this is not a factor typically in an aquatic ecosystem, unless maybe it's a wetland, which is sometimes wet, sometimes dry. But in the open ocean, you have no shortage of water. Then other factors become more of a...
Water's ours.
Oh, is it? Oh, somebody already put that there. So they'll get the point as well.
Woo!
Okay.
I didn't know.
And another thing, like I said, I want to point out that this is not all inclusive. Some of these are more of a factor, obviously, in aquatic or marine ecosystems. Water is not a limiting factor in a marine ecosystem, so we don't really think of it as one of the abiotic factors. So some of them are actual materials. Some of them are levels, like the temperature. You know, some of them are forms of energy, like sunlight. So any of these non-living things that will affect an organism in a particular environment, then those are the abiotic factors of that environment. And as I mentioned, you tend to build your environment from there. So you've got different types of organisms that through natural selection, which we'll look at more in detail later, you end up in an environment having organisms that are best adapted to that environment. In other words, their range of tolerance, sorry, not level, fits in well.
What?
Range.
Okay.
That's a weird. Let me fix that. Their range of tolerance fits in well with the normal physical ranges of that environment. Is it cold? Is it hot? Is it dry? Is it wet? Is it salty? Is it a lot of sunlight? Not much sunlight? So all those things are factors that build into that. Okay, so some things can, and I've talked about this a little bit before. We talked about how when you, for example, pollute a lake, let's say you make it eutrophic, and how it's not actually less productive. We'll look at what productivity means in a minute. It's not really less productive so much because you've got a lot of algae and bacteria that are doing a lot of photosynthesis, a lot of biology. It's actually going on in that lake, but it is very low in biodiversity because you've selected out for only a small number of organisms that have a range of tolerance that can handle those conditions. Okay. So that's how that is affected that by the environment. And then your biotic factors. So where's your abiotic factors? Are those things in the environment, those non-living things in the environment that affect an organism? Your biotic factors are going to be those living things in an organism that affects the in-case study organism we're talking about. Those other living things around. What do organisms rely upon other organisms in the environment for? And of course, the main one is, no, it's too vague. I'm not going to give you a point for that. Sorry, group one. What's the main thing we use other organisms for? Food. Yeah. Everything you eat was an organism. We do not eat rocks, typically. Yeah, I mean salt, and you could say salt has some nutritive value. Really, when we look at minerals, though, we typically, to be a food, it really needs to have some energy value, and salt does not. So food's a big one there, of course. Obviously, one of the big driving forces in an ecosystem. The relationships there, predator-prey, and parasitism, and all that other kind of stuff. Shelter, not nearly as much of a concern or value as food, but is very crucial in many cases. In particular organisms, i.e. trees and coral, that's their main function in an ecosystem. You get these big, huge trees in the rainforest. A lot of it is edible, but a lot of that tree there, that biomass in that tree is not edible. It's locked away. It's not part of the food chain. So in that way, it does not contribute to the rest of the environment. But the ability for many, many different things to live in there, to find shelter and stuff like that is a crucial factor for that. Now, shelter is less derived, for us it's more of a matter of comfort. Shelter in this case is more of a matter of protection, as well as not only just protection from your enemies, but it's also used by the predators as a place to lurk, to hide, to try to find their prey, etc. So it's a big factor in a lot of ecosystems. And population control. Now, this is the one that you would think of. If you're that individual that's getting controlled, i.e. killed, you think, hey, this is not such a good thing. Why would my species want this? But the fact is that all species reproduce at a rate that is greater than the environment can handle. That's part of the natural selection process. As a matter of fact, that idea was one of the things that Darwin formed a lot of his theory around, because a guy named Malthus saw this. He noticed that in any given population that many of the offspring end up dying, sadly, but true. Nature is cruel. So that's a necessary thing. Not only, of course, does it keep a population from using up the physical resources, which is disaster for an ecosystem, for everybody in that, but also it plays a role in natural selection, because much of the time those things are getting preyed upon, or those things are susceptible to disease, which is another type of this population control, are the weaker individuals in the environment and the population, and therefore they won't pass those weaker genes on. So there you go. Any questions about some of the basic parts of an ecosystem? No? Good to go? Okay.
So what are we going to do with
Okay. Why do we eat? Why do we eat? Zoe, why do we eat?
to survive?
Because you're hungry. What gives us that desire? What do it's to survive, and what do we get from our food?
Nutrients.
We get nutrients for like building up our body cells and tissues, etc.
Exactly.
Right? Is that it? Is that the only thing you get when we talk about how many calories are in a sample of food? Bless you. What is that? What are we saying about that food? What's that measurement of? Aziz?
Energy.
That's the energy, right? Calories is an energy unit. It's the amount of energy necessary to raise 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. It's totally physical, constant, not a constant, but a totally physical calculation. Has nothing to do with, well, directly, doesn't have anything to do with how fattening something is or something like that. It does, of course, end up having an influence on that, but that's really calories. And when they determine, when they look at the calorie content of food, they burn it. They put it in like a can, they call it a calorimeter, and put some oxygen in there, and they burn it completely and see how much temperature change occurs from that. And that's how they come up with a calorie rating for food.
That's cool.
So that's what we get from our food. These are the basic parts of the universe. We're going to ignore for now dark energy and dark matter because I have no idea what those things are, and apparently they're most of the universe. But for what we can observe, right? Huh?
We have dark matter in our brains.
I guess so. For what we can observe and everything, the observable universe is primarily matter and energy. And that's the matters of stuff, and energy's ability to move that stuff around, make things happen with it. So that's what we get from our food. That's what's necessary. It flows through the ecosystem through what we call a food chain. Chain of food. And each one of the steps along the food chain is known as a trophic level. Troph, you may remember from biology, perhaps heterotrophs, autotrophs, chemotrophs. Anybody remember those terms, perhaps? Basically, troph means eat. But each level on there, you have producers at one trophic level. Above that is consumers at another trophic level, and so on. Okay, so producers, what they're able to do, miraculously, I like to say, because of the fact that they do something that does not normally occur in the universe. As a matter of fact, it's something that kind of runs counter to the second law of thermodynamics. It doesn't technically. You can balance out the budgets and actually comes out to behave in the laws of the universe. But it's a really unique and rare thing, and you could argue that without the presence of enzymes, that none of this stuff would occur, and the enzymes would not exist if it weren't living things to produce them, etc. So you get kind of in a conundrum of trying to figure out which came first kind of thing, chicken or the egg type thing. But anyway, what producers do is they take simple compounds, carbon dioxide and water, and use energy from the sun and produce more complex molecules, in particular glucose at the beginning. Okay, glucose is a more complex molecule, molecular combination of carbon dioxide and water. That doesn't normally happen. Things don't usually get built. Things tend to fall apart, is what the second law of thermodynamics is. And that's why I said it's kind of runs a little counter to that. That is, of course, the process of photosynthesis. And it's a very good thing that happens. We've talked about before how the oxygen, well, oxygen is actually a byproduct. Oxygen doesn't serve a function for the producers. They don't even use the oxygen that they produce when they do need to use oxygen when they respire. We'll talk about plant respiration in a minute. But that is not actually, it's considered to be a byproduct of the process of photosynthesis, although it's, of course, good for us. The plants then do that. They take that, they make glucose primarily, but then, of course, from there they make all kinds of other stuff. So you've got your sugars and carbohydrates. Glucose, of course, is one of those. Some of them will take it and knock off a carbon and rearrange it and form fructose. That's what's going to be in your fruit sugar. The main thing the plants do with this glucose is they take one unit of glucose, flip another one around, lock them together, and form cellulose, the most common biological molecule on the face of the earth. Because this is what trees and grass and plants and all the plant fiber and tissue is all made out of cellulose. And it's actually not even digestible by most vertebrate organisms. So that's another thing to do with it. Then they'll take and make things like proteins and lipids and other things, kind of things that not only have carbon and hydrogen in them and oxygen, but they also have iron and calcium and phosphorus and sulfur and those kind of things. And where do they get those from? Those elements for plants, or where they get those minerals. And from the soil. From the soil, or if they're an aquatic plant, they will get them from being dissolved in the water. And this is a part of what's called assimilation. We'll use that term later, go into more detail about it. But it's what plants do. They build molecules. They build biological molecules here. Okay. And you're probably hopefully pretty familiar with the rest of the food chain. You've got things that mainly eat the plants. Those are what we call herbivores, also known as primary consumers, which are then, of course, eaten by carnivores. And then you have some consumers that eat a large amount, at least, or a fair part of their diet is carnivores, and that makes them what we call a tertiary consumer. How about us? Where are we in this lineup? Are we tertiary consumers? Top of the food chain? Humans, right?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, how many of you had snake for breakfast? Anybody? I didn't really. I just no snake eaters. How about a nice cat bacon? You know, cut the strips of belly fat off the cat and eat cat bacon. Nobody?
Why is it
No.
gross?
Huh? Because that would make us a tertiary consumer. Except for fish, we tend to not eat carnivores. Either they just don't taste good, or they're too tough, or gamey, or whatever. But we don't tend to eat those. We tend to eat mainly herbivores, cows, chickens. Pigs are omnivores, but pigs that we eat mostly grains, eat mostly corn and stuff.
Chickens, are they omnivores?
They're omnivores. One thing is that these are not strict categories. A lot of these will cheat, so to speak. Chickens, the ones that we eat, Justin, are fed primarily a corn diet, just like the pigs that we eat typically are too. Although some of them, at least the chickens, I think sometimes they'll let, if they're free-ranging chickens, so they might be able to get bugs and worms and stuff. But most of what they eat is corn, is grain. Okay. So anyway, we tend to eat we tend to be actually secondary consumers. Actually, in the industrialized world, we tend to be mainly secondary consumers And the developing nations, of course, are mostly primary consumers. They're mainly grain-based diet, that kind of thing. And we've talked about how this affects environmental impact in agriculture and stuff like that, our dietary habits. So let's move on to the next and final one. In some respects, one of the most important parts of an ecosystem that do the dirty work is your decomposers. Okay. Now, I do not want you to confuse these with what are known as detritivores or scavengers. For example, worms are not decomposers, and vultures are definitely not decomposers. Okay, worms and vultures poop. Okay, you want to write that down?
Fungi decomposers.
Yeah, fungi. They're we love those fun guys. Yeah, and girls. Fungi, and what's the other one?
Fungi.
Bacteria. These are your decomposers. When they poop salt. They give off, they excrete minerals and stuff. And the organic part of it, they break down into carbon dioxide and water vapor. So they actually get these minerals. Now the plants, you may remember, I talked about this when we talked about wastewater, as a matter of fact. Plants cannot absorb organic molecules. You can't put a plant on a piece of meat and expect it to grow. But if you allow that meat to be decomposed by decomposers, like it would in the soil, then those decomposers will give off your minerals, your calcium, iron, sulfur, phosphorus, that kind of stuff. Nitrogen is more, yeah, you'll get some nitrogen byproducts there as well. But a lot of nitrogen is actually supplied by bacteria. So decomposers are crucial. This is the part where I always say we co-opt nature, we go around it. And co-op's not the right word. We go against the laws of nature by taking our waste products and shipping them off somewhere else in our sewage systems and stuff, and by burying sealing up our dead people and burying them and keeping them out of the soil and stuff like that. That's where I say, if you want to serve the environment, go poop in an orange grove or drop Granny off in a corn pasture or something, cornfield. Yeah. So, but don't call me from jail sometime and say, Mr. Campbell, I took your advice and I got arrested. It's not going to stand up in court. I will forget who you were at that point. So what? You can't. You can't call and say, Mr. Campbell, I got busted for pooping in a.
If I died, I could just tell my family to bury me underneath a tree.
Unfortunately, that's illegal.
That's illegal.
It's illegal.
You can donate to
science. There are very, you can donate to science, but no, they're very specific because the disease organisms stuff. I mean, if the person has these, or just having a big rotting flesh, but in pretty much, as far as I know, all areas they have strict regulations about what you can do with dead bodies. So, all right, moving on.
That's weird.
One of the factors and one of the things that you can measure within an ecosystem is its productivity. It is basically just the rate of photosynthesis that is going on.
You're gone.
Well, I could do an area too.
And photosynthesis, of course, is done by what kind of organisms? Producers. So that's where we get the productivity. Producers' productivity. Okay. Of that ecosystem. All right. And one of the things that happens there, this is where ecologists subtract out part of it to they'll usually use net primary productivity to rate, so to speak, an ecosystem, because the plants have to use some of that glucose they form. Plants also respire. I mentioned this before. I've talked about how you can drown a plant. If you overwater your plant, it's because you drowned it because it needs to absorb some air into its roots, usually. That's where terrestrial type plants absorb their oxygen. And they need to do that because they carry out respiration as well. They have energy needs. And even though they produce energy holding molecules in the glucose, at times they will break down that glucose and use it themselves. I don't know why the system doesn't go straight to doing the work for it, but I don't question nature. Their stuff she makes is usually pretty good. So we call that the net primary productivity. So you take the gross primary productivity, which is how much photosynthesis is going on, how much the plants are doing in the a square meter, for example, and then subtract out the amount of that ends up being used by the plant, and therefore going right back out into the atmosphere, and we call that our net primary productivity, or NPP would be what that would be. Any questions? Okay. All right. All right, so we've discussed the second law of thermodynamics before. We discussed the fact that when you have a machine, you can never get 100% of what you put into it back out. There's always some loss to the surroundings. Okay, this is true in biological energy conversions as well, which is what digestion and assimilation and all the things that your body does are. Although there's thousands, perhaps even millions of different things of these kinds of interactions that go on in your body at any given time. So there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of chances for inefficiency, if you will. Although I hate to describe nature as inefficient, but yeah. But what happens, anyway, the way things balance out is that about 10% of the energy and the biomass of your food is passed to the next. I'm going to go ahead and give you this group one, but let's be more specific. The next trophic level. I know I didn't have two spaces, so there. That's my mistake. Okay. So next trophic level. So from producers to consumers. So for example, if you have a patch of grass that the cow is grazing on, okay, a cow, yeah, bovine animal. And that patch of grass has absorbed 1,000 calories of energy from the sun and has absorbed a kilogram of carbon dioxide, water, and other nutrients to make the molecules that grass is made out of. When that cow eats that grass, it'll only be able to use about 100 calories of energy, or 10%, from that grass. It'll only get that much. And the building blocks it gets from it will only be from a kilogram of biomass. It'll only get about 100 grams of that to incorporate into its body. Now this is an average. As you might imagine, this varies greatly from species to species, interaction to interaction. But the overall average that ecologists have observed is about a 10% exchange from one level to another. So this has a very high impact on the structure or the number of different types of organisms that you see in your basic ecosystem. By virtue of the fact that you're only going to be able to transfer about 10%, you're going to need 10 times as much food as the mass of the organism above it. In other words, you're going to have 10 times as many secondary consumers as tertiary consumers, or no more than 10 times, I should say. And this is by the way, this is by mass. Okay. So, one cow is the equivalent of thousands of mice, for example, but both of them are primary consumers. So this goes by biomass. And then 10 times as many primary consumers as there are secondary, and 10 times as many producers as primary consumers. So hopefully you guys got that figured out. That looks like you did figure out that notation there. Those being the different levels on the food chain. Okay. And you can see that if you go into an ecosystem, let's say you wander around through the forest, Mats, what are you going to see wandering around the forest? What's the main thing you're going to see in that forest? It's the reason why they call it a forest. Trees, right? Forests, yes. Trees. You walk around to the grassland, what's the main thing you're going to see? Grass, right. As a matter of fact, most ecosystems are named by the main producer that you find there. That's what you're going to see a lot of. That's what it has to be. Let's say your average forest in Florida, after you stop seeing the trees and the palmettos and all that, what's the next thing you might see as far as animals go? What? What do you see? Walking around the woods around here. You see about here, yeah, squirrels, right? That's the main thing you see. What kind of consumer are they? Primary, secondary, tertiary? Yeah, primary, yes. Unless you see squirrels munching on a rat or something, or a snake, they are primary consumers. They're primarily herbivores. They may eat the occasional bug or something, I don't know, but so they're prevalent because they have plenty of food because they're primary consumers. And then if you get lucky, you might see a snake or you might see a hawk or something like that, and that would be a secondary or tertiary consumer from there. So that shows you why in pretty much all ecosystems you're going to have a lot of producers, followed by about a tenth as many by weight primary consumers, and so on up the food chain. Okay. Now, one of the things that happens, one of the ways in which this, what we call that an ecological pyramid, by the way. And one of the things that happens because of this is that toxins have a tendency to build up as you go up the food chain. Things like pesticides that are persistent pesticides, and this whole process is actually why we got away and banned a lot of these persistent pesticides. That and the fact that they were showing up in environments much further away from where they were applied. And things like heavy metals too. Of course, these elements are not going to be broken down and become something else. They're always going to be an issue in the environment. And so they are not going to follow this 10% rule because they're not being metabolized. They're not being broken down for energy. They're not being used as building blocks. What your body and the body of most organisms, most vertebrate organisms does when it encounters these things is it tries to keep it from traveling the rest of the way through your system. Your liver is the main thing that does this. And it'll actually store it away, shunt it away in fat tissues. That's the main place it goes. And the reason for that, fat tissues do not have a lot of blood flow. They do not have, it's a storage, so they're not very vascular. Things that are in there can be kept away from other things. And let me go ahead and fill in the blanks here. This is known as bioaccumulation. All right, and then toxins pass through the food chain without decreasing because of that. So instead of, you guys need to sit tight, seniors. Sorry, I'm not going until I finish this. So they keep out in the same amount, and therefore, when you get up to the upper levels, you have the highest concentrations in your upper level predators. Highest concentrations, that says there. Sorry, I'm not sure what I put down there at the end. This is known as biomagnification. Biomagnification. Okay. First noticed in bald eagles, birds of prey that were populations were declining, yet they're not typically hunted and they're away from toxic sources. Any questions?
No.
All right, that's it. Seniors, you can go.